There is no way to describe the resiliency of Native Americans and Indigenous people without first discussing the conditions this resiliency was created in. In this episode, I want to detail the horribly oppressive ways in which early American settlers brought the indigenous population in America from 18 million down to 250,000. For the adults, it was extermination. For the children, cultural genocide. My name is Dre Breezy, and this is The Breeze and the History of American Anti-Indigenous Policy in Indian Boarding Schools. The history of racist policy towards Native Americans is long and full of terror. The assault on the Native American community has three prongs: introduce disease, attack the lives, and attack the culture. The eradication of Native Americans began with Columbus's second voyage from 1493 to 1496. The crew of his ship became ill, probably from influenza, and infected the native populations of Hispaniola, Cuba, and Jamaica. The native populations had no immunity to these new diseases, so the impact was severe. Disease combined with the violence of the Spanish colonizers decimated the indigenous population. Columbus was directly responsible for the decimation of these groups. He encouraged the raping, the pillaging, and material exploitation, so much so that he returned to Spain as a prisoner. In the context of Western imperialism and the Native Americans, the term genocide is often used. While the goals for Western imperialism weren't always to solely kill the native population, as with the Third Reich, the Native American populations were seen as collateral damage or a small obstacle in between what the imperialists wanted, which was wealth. Wealth has always been the driving factor for oppression in this country. Racism and bigotry are a means to an end towards that goal. Racism in America provided the emotional argument which kept Black people enslaved. Wealth helped create the legal argument. Enslaved people and their free labor were a huge source of capital for both the Southern and Northern states. Racism in America allowed early settlers to rationalize their killing of Native Americans and their treatment of Black people so they could get what they wanted, which was land. Land is equal to wealth. With Columbus, his expedition's goal was not to kill Indians, but as its leaders and men pursued their main objective, acquiring gold, they did exactly that. Understanding how these institutions massively profited off the exploitation of these groups and their descendants might help y'all understand the call for reparations for those same descendants. To obtain gold, Spaniards needed indigenous people's knowledge and labor, so they enslaved them, using violence to terrorize and intimidate native peoples into submission. This has been a tactic of imperialist nations throughout history. Japan's imperialism in China, Great Britain's imperialism in India, and China's current imperialism in Africa. Some accounts, such as one by Bartolomé de las Casas of Spain, detail making bets as to who would slit a man in two or cut off his head at one blow. They also recall tearing babes from their mother's breasts by their feet and dashing their heads against the rocks. These heinous actions are clearly fucking genocidal intent. History has shown that bigotry and fascism also often follow certain patterns. I want you to all begin recognizing the patterns of racist policy in America. This idea will come up again and again over the duration of this podcast. The patterns and negative feedback loops of bigotry are visible if you know what you're looking for and admit they actually exist. Racism against brown people wasn't solely extrajudicial killings and segregation. It's comprehensive legislative policy which reinforces a strict hierarchy system which places indigenous people and Black people at the bottom. When those people resist these oppressive laws, their respective governments punish them. See what Trump did in Portland a few months ago with the secret police kidnapping liberal civilians? How he gassed liberal protesters in front of the White House so he could have a photo op and send a message. Columbus began this negative feedback cycle, which continues to this day. These oppressive tactics are rooted in the pursuit of wealth. Leaders all over the world that put profit over the people use similar tactics to create a permanent underclass, often modeling American racism. The foundation of Hitler's policy towards the Jews were inspired by America's treatment of Black people. It's a fact. Western imperialists will regularly wage war and rape against Native people in order to terrorize them into submission. Violence fueled by bigotry was one of the many methods the West used to achieve their imperialist goals of excessive wealth and complete power and dominion over the land. Violence, then, was central to Spanish colonization in the Caribbean, although far more Indians died from disease, malnutrition, and starvation. So let's keep in mind Columbus never stepped his crusty feet on American soil. However, he did provoke exploration in the region. The violence and disease amongst indigenous people accelerated during the settlement of the Americas. Disease played a central role in the destabilization of thriving Native American communities. Previous to the arrival of the settlers, there are approximately 18 million indigenous people living in North America. Their numbers began to be drastically reduced. In 1696, smallpox spread rapidly, destroying Native American communities from the Carolinas to the Mississippi River. There are little records on total death counts, but the impact of disease was severe. This continued into the 1770s, transmitted by Spanish expeditions. In the 1830s, malaria decimated almost 90% of the Chinooks, a native population in the Northwest. Alongside battling disease from the 1770s to 1815, Native Americans had to deal with a hostile-ass military force called the U.S. Army. The United States expansionist policy left no room for Native American autonomy, freedom, or safety. U.S. forces burned hundreds of Indian towns in New York, Western Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Tennessee, Western Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, and Western Florida. In 1782, a Pennsylvania militia surprised a group of 100 Christian indigenous people in Ohio. They took a vote, which led to them killing all of the men, women, and children. A classic case of how often American Christians can and will compromise their values for wealth. I guess the commandment, thou shalt not kill, was just a suggestion. In 1779, the U.S. declared war on the Iroquois to punish them for defending themselves. 200 were killed. 1,000 died in refugee camps. In 1810, the Red Stick Creek tribe mobilized against American expansion. Andrew Jackson, in true American fashion, decided to have them all exterminated. The battle at Horseshoe Bend killed 800 American Indians. 200 to 300 of them were murdered while trying to escape across the river. Let's keep in mind that these people are trying to protect their homes and families, and American imperialism is killing them for doing so. They were here, living on this land for thousands of years, and the American settlers had no care or empathy for that. All the settlers had was entitlement. A special kind of entitlement that is bred into Americans. The same entitlement that we have when we travel to foreign lands and expect people to speak English. The same entitlement that encourages us to resist bilingual government signs. The same entitlement that got Ahmaud Arbery killed. It wasn't that the American government decided that it wanted to kill all indigenous people. We just decided we valued expansion and wealth over the lives of Native Americans. This practice continues today. The Keystone Pipeline sound familiar? On March 3rd, 1819, President Grant commissioned a peace policy with the tribes. This policy recommended that, quote, the Indians should, as far as practical, be consolidated on a few reservations and provided with permanent individual homes, that the tribal relation should be abolished, that lands should be allotted to individuals not in common, that the Indian should speedily become a citizen of the United States, enjoy the protection of the law, and made accountable to it. That, finally, It was the duty of the government to afford the Indians all reasonable aid in their preparation for citizenship by education in industry and in the arts of civilization. End quote. In reality, this law removed the Native American agents that supervised reservations and appointed Christian missionaries. It only further advanced the influence and control of the American government and the church over Native American people. In 1824, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was created by John C. Calhoun. The Bureau oversaw the removal era of Native American policy, which was spurned because the Native people were on land that America wanted to colonize. Up into this era, the American policy towards Native Americans was extermination. When this type of extermination was no longer plausible or morally acceptable, the American government began working on new policies to subjugate the Native American people. In 1830, Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. All Native Americans living east of the Mississippi were relocated into Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, Colorado, the Dakotas, Montana, and Wyoming. Since there was no more Western territory to push them towards, and extermination was no longer an option, cultural eradication became the next goal. Don't get it twisted. American racism is intelligent and methodical. It also evolves with the times. When the Native Americans resisted their genocide and these oppressive tactics, America waged war on them again. In 1832, during the Black Hawk War, the American Army fired on 200 non-combatants, killing all of them. In the Second Seminole War, from 1836 to 1842, the American government decided to arrest chiefs during peace negotiations, essentially tricking and blackmailing Native American populations into surrender. American diplomats would often trick Native Americans into signing over their lands, having them sign documents that they could not even read. During the 1850s, the gold rush was horrible to Native Americans. Settlers enslaved Native American children and formed militias to hunt them down. From 1848 to 1860, the Native American population in California and Oregon decreased by 120,000. Many of the wars we learn about in history were not wars, they were massacres. In 1864, the Cheyennes at Sand Creek, 500 Native Americans were killed, two-thirds of them women and children. In 1863, the Shoshones at Bear River, 300 Native Americans were murdered by American volunteers. Yes, you heard that right. Americans volunteered to murder Indigenous people. In 1870, the Blackfeet on the Marias River, 200 of the Piegan Blackfeet Indians, mostly women and children, were murdered by the American Army. In 1890, the Lakotas at Wounded Knee, 300 Native Americans were murdered by the U.S. Army. The American government wanted the Native Americans' land. They crafted racist policy and inflicted unwarranted violence to achieve that goal, which was economic superiority. Racist policy in America is often rooted in economics and promotes the concept that the wealth of white men matters more than the lives of brown people. When outright extermination became too expensive, American leaders came up with the idea of cultural genocide through assimilation. Carl Schurz, a former commissioner of Indian Affairs, he concluded that it would cost $1 million to kill a Native American in warfare, whereas it only costs $1,200 to school a Native American child for 8 years. In 1824, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was created by John C. Calhoun. In 1830, the U.S. forced Native Americans to move west of the Mississippi to make room for U.S. expansion with the Indian Removal Act. The boarding school experience for Native American children began in 1860 when the Bureau of Indian Affairs established the first Indian boarding school on the Yakima Indian Reservation in the state of Washington. However, this schooling only had one purpose: indoctrinating Native American children into subservience and grooming them to be the permanent underclass for white society. Essentially, white people wanted Native Americans to be Black people. The father of these institutions was Richard Pratt. Richard Pratt was a Civil War veteran. He believed assimilation was the only way to solve the Indian problem. Historically, he is most known for the phrase, kill the Indian, save the man. He came to his conclusions from the time he spent enslaving Black and Native American war criminals that had fought against the American army. Pratt became the jailer of 72 Cheyenne, Caddo, Arapaho, Kiowa, and Comanche prisoners at Fort Marion, Florida. Pratt eventually got these prisoners to learn English and become their own guards. This effect is also known as fucking Stockholm Syndrome. His success at turning the people he had imprisoned convinced Pratt and Native American reformers in Congress to authorize the Indian Bureau to turn the old Carlisle Cavalry Barracks into the first federally run off reservation boarding school. Pratt believed the methods he used on prisoners of war would be just as effective on children. Pratt himself had an interesting belief system. He believed that slavery was, quote, a more humane and real civilizer, end quote, than the reservation system. Slavery, he thought, was the ultimate Americanizer, quote, forcing Negroes to live amongst us and become producers, end quote, as opposed to the Indian reservation system. Pratt was one of the many white Americans that believed slavery was a gateway to integration and assimilation and sought to impose the structure used from slavery onto Native Americans in order to get them to submit. Once again, in this context, assimilation equals submission. The most saddening feature of Pratt's ideology was that it was viewed as progressive for his time. I guess when your only previous method was extermination, slavery does seem like a progressive idea. So there were two reasons for these boarding schools: to obliterate Native American society and to use Native American children as leverage against Native American elders, chiefs, or resistance leaders. The first class at Carlisle would be drawn from those most responsible for General Custer's crushing defeat in the Battle of Little Big Horn, the Lakota tribe. In 1879, Commissioner of Indian Affairs Ezra Hyatt ordered Pratt to recruit first from the Pine Ridge and Rosebud tribes because, quote, the children would be hostages for the good behavior of their people, end quote. The children were not taken willingly. Many of them were violently coerced. Parents who resisted sending their children to these schools were often severely punished. Government officials withheld food rations that families depended on, fathers were sent to prison, and in the most extreme cases, law enforcement ripped children from the arms of their mothers. Once again, the mission of these schools was not to educate. They were to get Native American children and their families to submit. These kids traveled hundreds of miles with strangers to boarding schools that were often formerly military barracks. At their arrival, they had their hair cut off and styled in Western cuts. They had to choose an Anglo Saxon name, and they were forbidden to speak their native language. For many tribes, the cutting of hair is very traumatic. It symbolizes the grieving of a relative. We've also discussed in our Janet Mock episode how oppressive cultures restrict bodily expression, the most obvious being the styling of one's hair. At the schools, the children were encouraged to follow strict gender roles. Half of each day was spent on industrial training. Girls learned to cook, clean, sew, care for poultry, and do laundry for the entire institution. Boys learned industrial skills such as blacksmithing, shoemaking, or performed manual labor such as farming. This way of life deeply contrasted with the more egalitarian nature of Native American communities and often gave these children skills that did not translate well into tribe culture. The missionaries state that goals of these schools were to teach Native Americans about the importance of private property, material wealth, and monogamous nuclear families, and the proper ways in which white men were responsible for all the good things in the world. Since the schools were required to be as self sufficient as possible, students did the majority of the day to day labor. By 1900, economic practicality became the goal, and school curriculum slanted even further towards industrial training while academics languished. During the summer months, these schools would often send children to work as domestic labor, also known as slaves, for white families where they were physically and sexually abused. These boarding schools were also very deadly. In the first 2 years, 16 Native children died at Carlisle, and 8 died after being sent home. More children died than graduated. Between 1879 and 1900, the Bureau of Indian Affairs opened 24 off reservation schools. By 1900, three-quarters of all Native children had been enrolled in boarding schools, with a third of this number in off reservation boarding schools like Carlisle. Confinement, deprivation of privileges, threat of corporal punishment, or restriction of diet were methods used often in order to break the will and spirit of these children. By 1900, 307 boarding schools and day schools had opened across the country, educating more than 26,000 Native students. Carlisle became the model for 26 Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding schools in 15 states and territories, plus hundreds of private boarding schools sponsored by religious denominations. From 1879 until 1918, over 10,000 Native American children from 140 tribes attended Carlisle. However, only 158 students graduated. As these boarding schools are literally stealing Native American children, the Native American community is also being ravaged by disease, war, and American imperialism. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act. This act divided up Native American lands by allotting not more than 160 acres to adult male tribal members for private ownership and then declaring the leftover land as surplus and selling it to non Indians. The land between natives was given priority to non natives. This officially legalized the breakup of Native American communities and tribes. Under this act, the Native American tribes lost some 90 million acres of land, an area the size of California. Property ownership and communal gathering is so important to the feelings of self worth within an individual. Racist policy in America knows this, and therefore, controlling how oppressed groups congregate and where they live has always been a defining feature of that policy. With Black people, there were Black codes and redlining. With the Japanese, there were internment camps. And with the Native Americans, there was the Dawes Act. Pay attention. I really want you all to start noticing the signs, controlling where you live. This is what racism looks like. It's not just being mean or nasty to people of color. Racism is policy. The government decides where you live and directs the way you can build your communities. It controls the language you can speak. It takes your children and then directs the dominant white community to enforce those racist rules with violence. Now for a message from one of our sponsors.
Do you want to get ripped and shredded without going to the gym? The makers of Slim Ass and Tybo present Muscle Tummy Tea. Just add this brew to your smoothie every morning and night, and you'll be sporting ripped triceps, biceps, and pectorals in as soon as 3 days. Muscle Tummy Tea works by activating all the parts of your brain that control rage, throwing them into overdrive. 30 minutes after taking our tea, you will enter a homicidal rage and have the irresistible urge to smash and destroy. Lamps, couches, mailboxes, electronics, grandma, none of them will withstand your rage. The calories you'll burn and muscles you'll build in this rage is better than any workout you'll find at Planet Fitness. It's like a reenactment of the purge every morning and night. To order a free sample, call 1-800-DEATH-RAGE. That's 1-800-DEATH-RAGE.
We are not responsible for any of the deaths that have occurred or will occur from this drug. I am very proud to introduce my first guest of the Breeze podcast. Her name is Lindsay Montgomery. She is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Arizona. She specializes in collaborative, community-based work with Indigenous communities in the American West and uses ethnohistoric and archaeological methods to study Indigenous interactions during the late pre-contact period, as well as how these communities negotiated and resisted Western colonialism. She has published several scholarly book chapters and articles in the International Journal of Heritage Studies, Journal of Social Archaeology, Advances in Archaeological Practice, and Museum Anthropology. I am more than excited to have her on. Hello, Lindsay. This is actually the first time I've gotten to hear your voice, and I forgot to ask you in your email, what are your pronouns that you prefer for me to use?
She, hers.
Okay, perfect. So we can just get started. How were you first introduced to this subject of history?
So I first got interested in this after I finished up with my PhD in anthropology at Stanford. I had a postdoc at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, where I was working alongside curator Chip Colwell on a collection of ethnographic objects and historic photographs collected by this Indian school teacher named Jesse Bradley, who worked at a lot of different reservation schools from basically 1893 until 1905. So he was working during this kind of really dynamic period in US history and in the kind of fruition of the American Indian boarding school system. So I got interested in it actually through objects associated with this Indian school teacher as he was out on these reservations in Oklahoma and South Dakota and Washington. And kind of diving into it through the actual material first.
Wow, that's really cool. Is everything kind of what you expected? Like, as you learned more about Native American history and culture, were there a lot of things that were shocking and surprising, or are you just kind of more objective about history?
Well, so my kind of doctoral work and my training is really focused on the Spanish colonial period, so the period prior to 1820. And so this was
Mhm.
kind of a new look for me at the U.S. period of history, and particularly looking at it through a native kind of lens or perspective. And what it brought out for me is just how little we learn about Native history in U.S. All the history that we learn in all the years that we're in elementary school, middle school, high school, it doesn't even scratch the surface of what the Native American experience has been like in the United States. And so to me, it was really eye opening to get to understand a little bit more about how the United States, as a settler colonial nation, has
Yeah.
interacted with Native people.
That's totally true. Like, as I was doing my research, everything I was learning seemed to be new, and all I could think about is like I went to what I would think is like a progressive kind of K through 12
Uh-huh.
institution in a kind of wealthier area. So this feels like information that maybe was intentionally skipped. And I don't know if you agree with me about that. And if that's the case, why do you think the American education system doesn't want to talk about these things?
I think it's not part of the narrative that the United States wants to promote about itself. I think U.S. History textbooks are still very much ingrained in a kind of manifest destiny style history, in which slavery, the Trail of Tears, are just minor kind of blips on the radar of America's great progress towards the nation state that it is today. So I totally agree that these things are not talked about in a kind of in-depth way, and they're not talked about in a representational way in proportion to how much they've affected our current economic and social distribution of resources. Certainly.
Mhm. Yeah, that's totally true. I think, throughout this episode, I'll try to connect just how wealth and bigotry through policy are so inherently connected.
Yeah.
Speaking of the earlier podcast, I explained earlier in this podcast about the brutal treatment of Native Americans by the American government and the military. Were all of these aggressions sanctioned by Congress? What exactly was the sentiment from Congress regarding Native American or indigenous people during this period?
Yeah, so there's kind of a transition that takes place over time uh, under U.S. colonial law. So during the early kind of formation of the United States as a kind of comprehensive nation that's bridging west of the Mississippi in the 1840s and 1850s, the congressional support was entirely towards a kind of raised earth policy of complete and utter warfare against Native communities. And this is where we see what's typically considered the Indian Wars period of U.S. history from 1860 up until about 1880, beginning 1890s. And so there's this kind of period of intensive warfare between the US government and Native communities. Beginning in the 1880s, there's a kind of shift in congressional sentiment towards how the US government should deal with Native folks. The shift happens, one, because of the effectiveness of this raised earth kind of warfare policy, which had essentially decimated the Native population in the United States or in kind of that North American area to about 250,000 people
Hmm.
from an estimated total population in North America prior to contact of 18 million. So just, I
Wow.
mean, that is shocking, right? And it
Hmm.
wasn't just warfare; it was also disease and things like that. But the population, the native population in the United States, had become very, very low. And so this coincided with a kind of growing sentiment among Congress that maybe there should be a more humane way that they start to deal with this remaining native population. And so there's a kind of shift towards assimilation as opposed to extermination as the kind of
Hmm.
policy.
Yeah, so this is a perfect transition to, boarding schools, which was totally wrapped up in
Yeah.
that assimilationist policy. But I found it interesting that there seemed to be a strong connection between the boarding schools that were created by the American government and the church. Would you care to elaborate a little on that?
Yeah, so this all kind of this connection really gets formalized under President Ulysses S. Grant, and in what becomes known as Grant's peace policy. So, what Grant's peace policy did, which he put in place in 1870, was to divide the 71 reservations that existed at that time between the three primary Christian sects in the United States, which were Episcopalian, Presbyterian, and the Catholic Church. Those reservations got divided up, and government dollars were then given to those parishes to support the education of Native children. This Christian education was really oriented toward Protestantism. The Catholic Church was involved and they had schools, but the kind of ethics and morality that was being taught within the vast majority of both church sponsored schools and just federally sponsored schools is drawing from Protestantism.
Yes, and as somebody that's grown up in the Protestant faith, there's so many different branches, and I'm just glad that the way I grew up wasn't the way that a lot of these Protestants kind of behaved during this time period. It seems to be really rooted in a very strict interpretation of gender roles and very strict interpretations of how we interact with the earth and how we interact with other people and other humans.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I was wondering, so these schools are created and, they start recruiting, not recruiting, that sounds like too nice of a word. They start nicely kidnapping Native American children.
Right.
How did the public respond to this? Did American people know about this? Did Was there any kind of public relations, program to get people on board?
So, in general, the American public, from what we know from historical sources, the American public seemed to be largely on board with the kind of progressive agenda of Grant and then subsequent presidents who really viewed education as being part of this kind of progress. It was tied, education was tied to progress, and white Americans really bought into that. And that kind of narrative of education for progress and assimilation didn't just apply to Native folks; it also applied to African Americans and other non-white, non-Anglo immigrants coming into the country at the time. So the American public was generally on board. Now, in terms of like what the government actually did, they one of their big kind of tactics was these before and after pictures, which started at Carlisle under Richard Henry Pratt, and he would do these kind of dramatic transformation images of Native kids who were taken from the reservation and then transformed into seemingly good middle class white American citizens by having their
Hmm.
hair cut, uniforms, uh, shown in kind of middle class discipline and military discipline. So they use these before and after pictures to demonstrate the effectiveness of boarding schools. The other thing that some boarding schools like Carlisle and Shiloko and other ones did was they would invite the public to come to the school to see displays of military parades. So the students would go out and some of them would have marching bands and they would do military style drills, flag parades, these sorts of things like that. And that was a kind of public relations tactic to try to demonstrate again the effectiveness of the schools for the general public.
It's interesting that you bring up kind of education, because I think the language when you talk about these boarding schools is really important, or when you talk about these kind of experiences or these initiatives, that this happens all over the world.
Mm.
But when I first started learning about these boarding schools, I couldn't help but make the connection to concentration camps. Just in the way that, like you said, they cut off their hair, they were forced to speak, only a certain way or speak English, and a lot of their culture was demonized. And in China, you hear nowadays, or in North Korea with re-education camps. I
Yeah.
think in a lot of ways, with oppressive regimes, they wrap up the oppression in kind of flowery language. We're educating. This is, and then when you splash the patriotism on top, it's like, and we're making wonderful American citizens. So there is that element of, I think, deceit that's wrapped in a lot of oppressive regimes, just so people aren't, the honest truth about what was going on would probably upset some people. So there's always, it seems to be a counterintelligence or counter information tactic that goes along with oppression.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there were no trigger warnings in the 1890s media, but
Hmm.
there's certainly it's certainly true that on the one hand, I think a lot of these progressive federal officers did believe in what they were doing. They did actually believe what they were saying in the sense that they had a genuine sense that education would help these Native children assimilate into the dominant society. But when we think about assimilation, what that really is a form of cultural genocide. And it's interesting that you brought up this idea of the Holocaust and the comparison, but a lot of Native historians and activists think about this period in U.S. history as a form of cultural genocide, the complete annihilation or the attempt to annihilate. I think that's important to point out. It's an attempt to annihilate all of the linguistic, cultural, religious, and familial structures of Native communities that they've had since time immemorial. And it is there is this kind of amnesia. I call it settler colonial amnesia that takes place as a way to erase the kind of negative effects of these policies.
Totally, totally. And a lot, I think, of the conversation, we have about Columbus and the statues of Confederate generals and soldiers is rooted in kind of that understanding that maybe the way that we've been taught was not necessarily as accurate, and it doesn't tell the full story.
Yeah.
So I think there's always a battle for the truth, and the truth really does have a lot of subjective elements, but we do have to I think we have to hold history accountable for the bad decisions even our leaders made.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yep.
so we're, talking about boarding schools. There's basically, are there kids from all ages that are going to these schools? Or are these just younger children?
Kids as young as 6 were allowed to be enrolled in boarding schools. Originally, boarding schools started out primarily for older children. So it was kind of centered around high school age children. But as boarding schools became more and more common over the 1890s and early 1900s, they opened up the age range of students who could participate. The counter to the boarding school were federally sponsored day schools. So these were day schools that were funded by the federal government on reservations, where students were in class from 10 to 4 p.m. and then they could return home to their communities. But the curriculum in the boarding schools and the day schools was exactly the same. So as I was talking about, originally usually young kids would be at these day schools, and then they would matriculate to boarding schools. But over time, day schools became less and less common, and boarding schools became the primary space for educating Native folks.
Mhm. Yeah, we talk about the curriculum,
Mm.
and from what I've read, it seemed to be really rooted in learning how to be, a domestic or pretty much cheap labor. Am I wrong in that analysis?
No, I wish I could say you were. No, it was educate. It was education for entry into the lowest wage labor sectors of the U.S. economy. It was industrial training in things like domestic service. Right, women were taught how to sew, how to clean, how to mend. Men were taught how to till the field, kind of industrial agriculture, blacksmithing, uh, all of these types of blue collar kind of jobs. And the thing is that the BIA didn't have the Bureau of Indian Affairs didn't actually have a great success rate. So even though they prepared students to enter these low wage jobs, they didn't account for rampant discrimination, which
Hmm.
denied many Native people even access to the jobs that they were trained to do.
Yeah, that's I was just reading about there's a big initiative from governments to legalize protections against trans people in the workplace or transgendered people in the workplace, and a lot of my transgendered people I speak to are like, that's great and everything, but we first have to get jobs. Like, we first have to be able to show up to an interview and people don't laugh at us,
Right.
laugh us out the room. So I think it's really interesting to talk about not only having legal protections for people, but also having financial access. People have to have access to resources and finances to really be able to do anything well.
Yeah, yeah.
You spoke about the government would introduce the public to, for military drills to kind of show off the success of these schools. And while overall it seemed like these boarding schools were really brutal for these kids. We can talk about the actual deaths later. Were there any success stories? Was there anything that good that came out of these schools?
So it's hard to think about uh, the term success. It doesn't necessarily feel like it fits the scenario. I've been thinking about this because what does it mean to be successful when if you're a survivor of these kind
Hmm.
of assimilationist institutions? And I think one of the ways that we might be able to talk about success in this context is to point to people like Chauncey Yellow Robe or Elias Parker. These are Native students who were enrolled in boarding schools. Chauncey Yellow Robe went to Carlisle. He was actually one of the first Native people from the Lakota Sioux tribe on the Rosebud Reservation to go to Carlisle. And I don't want to say that he thrived, but he used his education to actually better the trajectory, the historical trajectory of his people. So after graduating from Carlisle, he went back. He went back to Rosebud to South Dakota. He worked in the Bureau of Indian Affairs at various different boarding schools in Montana and Nebraska, and eventually he even worked at Carlisle. And he started a lot of organizations that were geared towards increasing the kind of human rights and representation of Native people in the government. So he started this organization called the Society of American Indians. And this was the first national American Indian rights organization that was ever founded. It was founded in 1911. And Chauncey Yellow Robe was a key component to the creation of this organization. And he, along with other Native intellectuals that were kind of called red progressives, really tried to work within the rhetoric of white reformers to create opportunities for Native people. So he's kind of a success story in the sense that he maintained his culture. He was not assimilated, as the narrative would have you believe. And he used his education within these boarding schools to actually advocate on behalf of his community.
Yeah. What I found most interesting was that a lot of these schools did seem to have a good majority of, Native American teachers. How how were they able to pull that off? How were they able to get people to get on board with this?
So during the 1880s and 1890s, the Congress decides that two things are missing from Indian boarding schools. One is field matrons. So they needed women, they needed to employ more women to actually teach Native youth how to do all these domestic chores. Like the sewing and cooking and all of these things. So they create this position of the field matron, which gets more women to actually join the Indian service. And the other thing they do in the late 1880s is they start hiring Native people as not usually as teachers, but as laundresses, as cooks, as these kind of lower wage positions within the Indian school. And the reason they do that is because of what we were just talking about. Native educated folks couldn't get jobs anywhere else, so they created this pipeline for people who graduated from boarding schools to end up being back in boarding schools as educators and as these kind of nurses and cooks and laundresses. And so basically by 1900, about 45% of Indian school teachers were Native themselves, which is pretty profound. That's a pretty huge percentage
Yeah.
of the total number of teachers there. These kind of Native teachers were really cultural brokers. They were there kind of mediating the tensions and the trauma that Native youth were experiencing in these institutions. And there's lots of examples of Native teachers actually kind of using bilingual teaching as a way to work around these bans on speaking Native languages. And so
Hmm.
they would teach kind of core concepts in the Native language and use kind of Native pedagogies that were rooted in the land and in kind of drawing and these sorts of kind of visualization tools to help teach kids English. So they were kind of profound cultural brokers.
Yeah, but they're also, re-experiencing that trauma, which is just, I couldn't imagine being put in that position where, people always say, I think during, certain administrations or, this presidential administration that they stay because they want to work from within. So
Yeah.
it kind of puts them in this position where they're like, if I leave, I know there's no there's no guarantee that who replaces them is going to, have any kind of actual care or concern. So I get the, wanting to like work from within the system to fix it or to help these children. But at the same time, the system is clearly set up in a way to be directly oppressive. So there's only so much, there's only so much counterbalance or counter damage, you can do. But I would love to learn. I don't know if there's much literature about that, but I would love to read a book to see if anybody's captured their stories, because we elevate a lot of people, I think, in American society that aren't heroes, but people like these teachers are the real heroes. People that put everything on the line to for the common good, for the collective good.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they're really these teachers, these native teachers were really put in a kind of tough situation where they not only had to try to negotiate the economic realities that were all around them, but they had to kind of negotiate what were your I mean, what were your options here? I mean, you could stay and try to work within your community, right? You could be close to your family, but be part of this kind of, I mean, for lack of a better word, a horrifying institution, which you survived. Or you could try to go to an urban space and face another form of discrimination and trauma. So, I mean, I agree. It's people talk about teachers being heroes, and I definitely agree with that. And I think these Native teachers were particularly heroic. I don't know of anybody writing about it, though.
I know we always we always wait, I think, too long to tell the interesting stories,
Hmm.
and so many of them get lost, and so many of them just, or maybe there's just like an oral legacy in tribes. But
Yeah.
this is information that everyone needs to know. These are Americans, these are people that were here way before us, and that history is our history as well. You mentioned in our correspondence that these schools were put on display at the world fairs. Can you tell us more about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, so this was one of those kind of discoveries in my own research where I was shocked that boarding schools were actually on display at the world fairs. So there was two exhibits that were done, one in 1893 at the Chicago World Fair and one in 1904 at the St. Louis World's Fair. And the kind of gist of these exhibits was that the Bureau of Indian Affairs, in a kind of concert with the Smithsonian Institution, would create these live to life replicas of boarding schools. And then they would bring in Native students who were nominated by their teachers as being particularly good students to participate in the display. And then these kids would reenact their day. They would demonstrate learning, their learning of arithmetic, their English lessons, their civics lessons. And they would demonstrate their industrial skills at blacksmithing and things like that. And then alongside of these exhibits of the Native boarding schools, they would then show what was called the Native American Village, the American Indian Village. And this was where they would do full scale replicas of traditional homes. They would have Native parents there doing traditional crafts and just kind of setting up a basic contrast between the old life of Native people and the future of Native America as part of this kind of grand uh, American civilization. And that's really what the fairs were about. They were about demonstrating the grandeur of European and American civilization and performing that for the world and for public. So the boarding schools were a really central facet of that for within the United States and for their World's Fairs.
That's so crazy. I don't know. For some reason, you were telling me that, and I just kept getting flashbacks of like Matilda, the movie. And just, it's so like that's almost like a cliche motif. Like like there's like the evil school teacher, and then
Yeah.
when the superintendent comes, all of a sudden, she's super nice, and all the students are so well behaved. And then when everyone leaves, they go back to like cracking the whip. And it's just I just wish there could be some consistency in with everything. Like if you really want to have this program that educates, these people, these indigenous people, like just follow through with that. Like, and don't make it performative. Like
Yeah.
performative education is almost counterproductive to what education should be about.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, whether or not the federal government actually um, I think they did believe that they were being effective. They would often do surveys and metrics with Native students after they graduated to see where they ended up. And of course, like in classic kind of governmental form, the surveys always demonstrate that the program is being very successful. And whether that's actually true, right? And
Yeah.
what actually is happening on the ground seems to present a different story. But I will say the public really bought it. You can find accounts of World Fair goers who saw these displays, and almost all of them resoundingly say, like, look at the US government. Aren't they doing a great thing? Look at how well they're civilizing these Native students.
Hmm. So, how deadly were these schools? From what I read, it seems like, I mean, there was always deaths every year.
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
Yes. I mean, boarding schools. So we'll separate day schools versus boarding schools. Boarding schools had a huge death toll of students. Thomas King, a Cherokee writer, in his most recent book, estimated that about 50% of Native people who entered a boarding school died there. That's one in
Wow.
two, every 1 in 2 students for both the United States and Canada, because Canada also had a residential school program. And that's a huge kind of shocking statistic. I mean, it's on par with the statistic of 18 million to 250,000 people by 1890, right? It's a really horrifying number. People died there for a lot of reasons. One big one was disease, cholera, smallpox, um, these sorts of infectious diseases that continued to impact Native health into the early 20th century. Another big one was physical abuse. Native children were essentially used as free labor. They operated the entire school. They were the cooks. They were the people who did the mending. They were the people who tilled the fields. They were, I mean, any child labor law today would clearly say that this was illegal. And there was also a huge amount of kind of neglect and the lack of health care for Native students who got sick or who suffered from these abuses to actually rehab them was pretty abysmal.
Yeah. And it sounds like at this point in time, the mental and spiritual trauma, has to take some type of toll. If I'm in a class and by the end of my class, half of my classmates are dead, I mean, that's going to traumatize me.
Yeah,
And I'm sure it traumatized, the families of these Native American, and to know this is being endorsed and supported by the government of the country you live in just has to be almost, what's the word I'm looking for? Um, I can't, of course, I can't think of it. But it really just has to be like shocking and jolting and
yeah,
and alienating to feel that
yeah,
the government that should be at the minimum supporting you is almost taking a hostile, not almost taking, is certainly taking a hostile attitude and a hostile energy towards
yeah.
your race.
Yeah, right. I mean, if we go back to the kind of basics of Hobbes and Locke, and we think about what is the role of the state uh, in relationship to its citizens, the number one role of the state is to protect its citizenry, right? And
Hmm.
by having these boarding schools, what kind of protection are you actually affording Native
Hmm.
people? I mean, I think the state fails miserably on that account of actually protecting its citizens from neglect and abuse.
Yeah, and when I did a little research earlier, and I was like, well, maybe there was, a lack of representation, and uh, the numbers are since 1789, 12,348 people have served in Congress. Only 22 of them have been Native American. Do you think a lack of representation is the reason? While a lot of this kind of, but before I can say that, I will say during this time there were two Native American senators. There was Charles Curtis, who was a senator from 1906 to 1926. He actually became the vice president in 1928. And then there was Robert Latham Owen, who was a senator from 1907 to 1925. So, was there a disconnect between representation and ending boarding schools, or maybe a more critical approach to the failures of these boarding schools, or did these people not give a shit?
I think representation is always an issue, and this is an issue that was brought up during the civil rights movement by African American freedom fighters, and it's certainly an issue that pertains to Native Americans as well. Is that representation in the congressional and senatorial branches provide you at least with a platform from which you can advocate? I think a lot of Native senators and congressmen were concerned with essential issues of sovereignty. And so they were oriented towards trying to make sure that Native communities would not be dissolved by the federal government and that they would be able to maintain some elements of rights to their lands and to the protection of their traditional beliefs. I don't know whether boarding schools were on the radar in terms of a major issue of reform for a lot of Native Congress people at this time, because there were so many other issues that were just fundamental to even maintaining the basic political structure of Native communities. So I think a lot of that the effort was towards sovereignty. It's starting in the 1920s, and really in 1928 with what's called the Merriman Report. Congress starts to look more critically at these boarding school programs. And that Merriman Report is a kind of damning denunciation of all these things that we were just talking about: the neglect, the abuse, the child labor, the poor living conditions. So, in that report, that actually precipitated some reforms in the early 1930s where the federal government increased money to boarding schools, and they also increased money for federal state contracts to support the placement of Native children into public schools. So it's starting in the 1930s that you have a concerted effort to not only make boarding schools better, but to actually move more Native students into the public school system.
So, we're talking about sovereignty and really establishing a strong base for kind of the human rights of Native Americans. What eventually ended these schools, or and have they ended, or what's
Yeah.
exactly the legacy of these schools?
I think we're kind of talking about the ways in which history is configured in particular ways, and I think this history of boarding schools and of Indian education uh, is, again, it's kind of ended too soon because there are still federally sponsored boarding schools that exist today. There's about 8% of Native children enrolled in these federally funded schools that exist on 63 reservations. So there's no end. There wasn't an end to this program, but there was a kind of major shift starting really in the late 1960s, early 1970s, where the number of boarding schools in operation steeply declines, and they make kind of radical reforms to how the curriculum at those schools to orient them much more towards a kind of culturally competent form of education that wasn't based on this kind of assimilationist model. So there are boarding schools open today, and Native children, about 40,000, are still enrolled in these schools.
Wow, that is like, that blows my mind. I mean, just based off of the legacy that these institutions have, I mean, I think at this point in time, just scrapping all of them would be the most reasonable choice. What exactly is the alternative for Native American youth to learn more about their culture?
Yeah, so there's Like I said, most Native folks now Native kids are in public schools. Some tribes have actually started their own public schools on reservations where they have these kind of culturally oriented curriculums that focus on bilingual teaching and try to use Native pedagogy to educate their youth. There's also, of course, tribal colleges and universities that begin to flourish in the 1970s as well as a form of higher education that again is rooted in these kind of native cultural beliefs and languages. So those native run institutions have really increased and definitely provide a space for cultural education. But again, the vast majority of Native students attend public schools. And if we think back to what our public school education was like, I grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. Again, I didn't learn anything about native native culture or that identity would even be recognized as something that existed.
Well, well, it sounds like we have, some more work to do.
Yes.
But I just wanted to, I think we can wrap it up there. And I just wanted to thank you so much, Lindsay. Like, this means so, so much to me. You are actually my first guest. And this is all new for me. But it's super exciting. And I just can't thank you enough, like, just for taking the time out of your day to educate us because the world is definitely suffering from a lack of education. And once again, just thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity. This is being able to kind of start to undo that historical amnesia is a huge motivator for me in my work, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Well, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, bye, Dre.
Bye. Are you feeling kind of stuck, kind of trapped in America? Work yourself to death, get in debt, hit your parents up, asking for some change. They ain't got it because they struggling too. It's all on me. I gotta hustle for my family and my crew. I won't give up. I'm gonna vote for my life and for you. Vote. Okay, so we are way over time with this episode, so we're gonna have to split this up into a part two. And I just want to thank you all so much for listening to my podcast. My name is Dre Breezy, and you can follow me at Dre Breezy on Instagram or Twitter. And if you want to read any of my stories or more, you can find them on my website at www.findthebreeze.com. Lindsay, thank you so much for being my guest and joining me for this episode. And you all take care, and don't forget to vote, and hug somebody if you can.